So we started chapter 3, and he says, at the beginning of Parag Gimel, he says in general outlines, and then at the bottom of the first page, he starts explaining in more detail what he had already said. So we'll start from that point here. It's the 2 dots, it's the last 3 words of page Zayin. It says, Ubi'ur ha'inyan, elaborate on the topic. Hine, sorry. כי הנה השכל שבנפש המשכלת, והוא המשכיל כל דבר, נקרא בשם חוכמה, כוח מה. So what he's going to do now is he's going to go through the 10 sefirot, just so we know what we're stepping into. He explained before that, that the soul can most generally be divided into 2, gal vezat, mindly attributes and the emotional attributes, if you would. And now he's going to go through that in more detail, not completely, he doesn't go through every single one of the 10 sefirot, but he'll go through the mindly faculties and at least the general emotional faculties, and explain the process of how they develop, how they evolve. Where the point that, again, we always want to stress here is like the logic of this whole portion of Tanya is to describe how the entire godly soul, how the entire revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a personality within a person is all the entire soul, the whole structure, all the way down to the garments of the soul in the next chapter, are all an evolution of the same point, of the same etzem, of the same essence. There's Chelek Elokei Ma'al Mamash, there's a HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The godly soul is part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's essence. And all of what we're describing now is to see how all of the details and the elaborated personality that evolves from that is all an expression of that point. So the most important stage to notice that is the starting point that we're reading right now. The first sentence that we just read, which is, maybe I'll say just one thing in general common knowledge in Kabbalah, that this could be described as a technical issue in all sorts of aspects of how a world develops or how any structure develops, or as a psychological issue. I said before, the Rabbi divided the soul into mind and heart. I think last week I mentioned that hypothetically we could debate in great length the very, very different varying options of how to divide a soul. What would be the most logical way to divide a soul? I think last week I mentioned the division he says here between first 3 faculties and the bottom 7 faculties, the mind and the heart, very classic. That's dividing between Yud K and Vav K. If you were dividing Hashem's name, Yud K, Vav K. Just as classic as that, like the other division you could do, which in a sense we could say, as I'll explain in a second, that he has already alluded to that in the previous chapter, is like if I'd ask a Kabbalist or a Chassid, somebody learning Chassidus, how would be most reasonable to divide a soul into 2? And either he'd say this, right, mind and heart, or he'd say Keter and all the rest, crown and everything else, which would be like Makif v'Pnim, the unconscious, so superconscious and conscious. So in a sense, that's even more like a more seminal way to divide the soul, even more basic. Now, as I said, to a certain aspect, the Alter Rebbe has alluded to that already, because the previous chapter discussed the essence of the soul, which is simply referring to the unconscious and the superconscious layers of the soul, Etzem HaNeshama, which is like the Keter, the crown. It's a known thing in Tanya, I think we've mentioned this before, that the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention the faculty of Keter at all, in the whole book. It's not mentioned. And everything that's usually referred to as Keter in Chassidus, like Mesiras Nefesh, V'chulei, Emunah, all these things are all packed into Chochmah, into the Sfiras HaChochmah in Tanya. So the highest like technical faculty that Alter Rebbe ever discusses in Tanya, in Likutei Amarim. In other portions in Tanya, he does discuss Keter. But in Likutei Amarim, in the part of Tanya that we're studying now, the avoidic part of Tanya, he only mentions Chokhmah. Now, why? Simply because what Chokhmah is like the verse says, Reshit Chokhmah, it's the beginning of your consciousness. So now, in light of what I just said now, first of all, we understand that this very fundamental division that we're discussing here between mind and heart is more precisely the most reasonable way to split your consciousness into two, like your pneumius, your experiential awareness. But it could be even more reasonable to first split between your unconscious and your conscious. That could be, in a sense, an even more reasonable split, which is actually what he did between chapter 2 and chapter 3. And just to get a general picture. Now, since he's not discussing this, why is that the case that the Alter Rebbe doesn't discuss the superconscious at all? It's not that he doesn't discuss the superconscious. He discusses the fact that there are intuitive, instinctive, superconscious entities all the time. He just calls them Chokhmah. He doesn't call them Keter. He doesn't use the phrase Keter, which again is not, that's given anywhere else in Chassidus. It is used explicitly. So, I mean, I don't know if there's like a known explanation why the Alter Rebbe does that. I recall, and it seems very reasonable to me, is that that all of this portion of Tanya is all the Alter Rebbe's instructions, instructing us in our avoida and what we need to do. So it's all discussing our conscious service of Hashem. It's like a practical discussion. It's not a hypothetical dissection of your psychology. It's a practical guide of the service of Hashem. Now, in that practicality, the Alter Rebbe goes into a lot of anatomy and explanation. All the explanation, all the theory that he describes is all part of the practicality. So also your superconscious faculties are relevant to him where they appear to you, where they become part of your life, not as a hypothetical topic to explain, but as a practical instruction in life. So all of Tanya discusses where the keter, where the crown reflects into your consciousness. That all comes through chokhmah. So all the faculties of the crown, like we said, like Mesiras Nefesh, faith, will, all these things all appear in Tanya as something that's flashing through your chokhmah, which is also how they seep into me consciously, to seep into my consciousness. Now, relatively, what I'm saying now is like a known thing. I don't know how much we'll get into it, but the ratio, like the process of appearance between your superconscious and your conscious, or in Kabbalah between Keter and the other Sfirot, is relatively ex nihilo. Like Chokhmah is yesh me'ayin to Keter. Keter is ayin and Chokhmah is yesh. It's an infinite leap. And this is very important to what we discussed a little bit last week. We also spoke about evolutionary processes. I'm saying now a new ratio, another ratio. It's important to understand when we step into the process he's going to describe, that from Chokhmah downwards, everything is evolutionary. Chokhmah appears out of Keter, ex nihilo. It's like a seed, and everything else that develops, Bina, Dat, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, it's all an evolution of that seed. So Chokhmah includes your entire self in a seminal stage, and everything else is relatively an evolutionary process out of that seminal stage. The Chokhmah itself is yesh me'ayin to the Keter. We'll try to explain that a little bit more. What's the question?
Yes, so I'm very curious what causes that infinite leap. How do we bring Keter down into Chokhmah? What do we need to do?
Again, maybe I'll describe what this means. The question maybe would be different. It's not how we bring it down. What Chokhmah is the bringing down of Keter. Chokhmah appears as a finitized infinity. Like if you have, we'll try to explain this very experientially. how it happens in our soul. That I'll say an example of how usually Chochmah is explained, and then we'll see that it's not. I get it. The explanation I'll say now, it explains things well, but it's not precise. And when we read out the Rebbe's words, even though I've seen people explain it this way, but when we'll read it inside, you'll see that that's not exactly what he's saying. He's saying something a little bit different, but it will help us understand what he is saying. So the classic explanation for Chokhmah, usually in Chassidus, which is, again, much easier to explain, and as we'll see, it's not what's written here, but we'll mention it anyway, is that Chokhmah is like I said now, the beginning of consciousness. So for instance, if I'm studying a certain, I'm studying Gemara or whatever it is I'm doing, I'm thinking of an idea, I have a problem I need to solve. I have a certain darkness. Yeah, I'm trying to understand something. I'm trying to come up with a new idea. And so the easiest setting for that is I'm studying like a daf in Gemara. I don't understand what it says, and I'm racking my mind to understand it. But we could say a more conventional example, just that you have, you need to have a blackout in your mind and you need a new idea to get going. But to give an easier setting, let's say you're in a process of study and you read a page in the book and you don't understand what it says, and you're thinking very hard. And at a certain point, like they say in Hebrew, they say the nafala siman, the coin drops, right? There's like a moment, like in the cartoons, you have like a flashlight pop up over your head, right? There's like a moment of enlightenment. So what is that moment? You get, first of all, it's full of light. It's a very lit up moment, like that flashlight in the cartoons. So even you could say maybe that it's not processed yet. Like if I'm studying now with a chavrusa and we don't get it, and suddenly I say, oh, wait 1 second. And so if you ask me there, what did you understand? So I haven't understood. Understanding is like bina. So I haven't really understood anything. So I tell you, say like, wait a second, hold on 1 second. It's coming to me. So what happens when something's coming to you? So it's as if, I've said before an allegory for this. It's like if you put a cup at the bottom of the sea. Like if you open a cup to the bottom of the sea. So when the cup opens up to the bottom of the sea, so it just becomes part of the borderlines of the sea itself for a moment. So it's like an intermediate experience. When your mind opens, you're like exposed to your unconscious, like seminal intellect. And therefore it feels like, practically, if I'm studying Gemara, I could feel for a moment as if in this idea that's coming to me now, I've solved the entire Shas. Now that's probably going to turn out to be not true. But the experience is so enlightened, like when the coin drops, when you hop an idea, like the first seminal flash of realization is so brilliant. What is that brilliance? That brilliance is that it's as if you're opening up to your unconscious. So you're exposed, like you're exposed to a relative infinity. Now, when you catch something, like that's why I said that paradoxical phrase, like when you catch something of that infinity, like a point, like a seminal point of your capacity of intellectualization, and you develop it and you evolve it and you elaborate and explain it so much so that after a few seconds you can then turn to your chavrusa and narrate what it is that you understood. What at first was like, I couldn't say anything. It was the first second of realization. So it's like, don't bother me, right? You give me a second. It needs to come to me. But eventually, B'ezrat Hashem, it comes, it settles, and you can narrate it. When you narrate it, it becomes something finite. It becomes a very finite idea. Maybe some of it's right, some of it's wrong. It solves this problem, it doesn't solve that problem. The initial like infinite experience of realization is because you grasping a thought involves exposing, like opening up to like the source of intellect. And then it's like your vessel becomes part of the outline of the sea. When you close back up, so you're left with the seminal point, which is like that's what the phrase I use, like a finitized infinity, like a piece of infinity. So this is a good a good. I mean, it's a little bit coarse, but it's a good idiom for what the experience of chokhmah is. Like you've opened up to something that's relatively an infinite layer of yourself, and but on the other hand, what you catch is like a very seminal point. That's why chokhmah corresponds to yud, the yud kevap. It's like a point. So it says in Kabbalah that the yud has a higher spike. It's called the spike on top of the yud is what it is. It's coming out of infinity, and the lower spike, which is called the stem of the yud, is what it inseminates the womb of bina, of understanding. But really, what this point of yud is like a mathematical point. It has no dimensions. Obviously, when you draw a yud on a Sefer Torah, you have to have dimensions. But essentially, what a dot really is something that lacks dimensions. It's something that really, it exists and doesn't, like in mathematics. Like a point in mathematics, a dot is, it exists, but it has zero dimensions. And it's infinitely small. You can never zero into it. Same thing here. Chokhmah is like an intermediate between, it's a finitized infinity, like an intermediate between the two. So it's not, I'd be more comfortable phrasing, it's not a question of how I bring down my unconscious. It's more what we're trying to explain is that what your consciousness is a flashing of your unconscious. That's what it is. So if you're around, then something of your unconscious is like dripping into your consciousness. And it's not just dripping, because there's obviously a constant, some constant relationship between your unconscious and your conscious. But to try and explain it that way, like in a more understood manner, so we're trying to take like secluded scenarios in life, like an idea, one specific idea. So one specific idea, you can try and pinpoint this process where something drips into consciousness that becomes your consciousness. That seminal idea becomes who you are, and it will later develop into an understanding, which will birth an emotion, and that emotion will drive a behavior. That behavior will create an action. So it's like from this point, relatively, it's like an inevitable evolutionary process. Like, again, like a seminal seed developing in a womb and birthing life and living. But really, everything that comes of that 80-year-old person, it's all there seminally in that first moment of insemination. But that seminal self, that's really ex nihilo. That comes yesh me'ayin. It's taking something that's completely not finite and leaping it into finitude, like you're taking a piece of it. So that's a certain idiom. Yeah.
So is it your effort in trying to solve the problem that allows it to come down? I mean, is there something you're consciously doing to bring down the subconscious, or it's just random when it comes down?
So this is the point. Now you're touching on the point where I said that this example is a good example, but it's not what it says here. If I wanted to like place that example I just said now into Kabbalistic terms, so this would be chokhmah shebebina, chacham bebina. Why? Because if you be precise of what I said, then the example I mentioned was like a person, again, working his understanding or lack of understanding until he reaches a point of enlightenment. So it's like the first moment was from the bottom up, and from there onwards, we caught that flash of chokhmah, and we called it the beginning, and we depicted the rest as a process. But really, that's not what it says here. So if we take this example I mentioned to one level forward to a more precise example. So it's like saying that it's not an effort you need to do at all. This is what's happening to you all the time. I chose an example where it's something that comes in the background of an effort because it's easier to notice. It becomes more noticeable. These stages are something that's more easier to explain and to notice in an effortful example. And to try and picture my constant consciousness as a seminal flashing, constantly developing, it's harder to chop it because the seminal flashing is, again, it's borderline conscious. I'm not completely conscious of it. My consciousness begins from that point. So I don't really have the before and after picture. As far as I'm concerned, it's just a given that I am, and my consciousness is happening. I don't experience the reshit chokhmah. I don't experience the seminal, like bursting into creation of myself.
Mm.
That's why I chose an example where I didn't, I lacked some consciousness, and then I effortfully like forced it, so it's easier to notice that something happened here. That there was a renewing of consciousness. But really, what this is trying to express is that this is happening all the time. This is what your consciousness is. Your consciousness is a constant evolution of a seminal flashing of your existential self.
Mm.
Now that seminal stage is called Chokhmah. So how would we call Chokhmah? So very often in Hasidus, Chokhmah is called the seed of consciousness, like the point of, as opposed to understand like in Kabbalah, there's an example between Chokhmah and Bina, that Chokhmah is like walking, you walk outside the village, like in the middle of the woods at night, and it's completely dark, and there's a flash of lightning. This is an example that's written in books. And for a moment, you get like a view of everything. Like you view for a second, you get a clear view of everything, but it's like a lightning flash. And then it goes away. And then you need to step by step in your mind to recreate it. That's Bina. So again, this is one way of explaining Chokhmah. It's a seminal flash that includes all the details in a seminal form. And the rest of the process of development of this seed. That's not what he says here. So we'll read it from inside and we'll see how he phrases it very, very deeply. It's very similar. And when we'll contemplate on it, we'll see he's saying the same thing, but he's saying it much, much, much purer, much truer. And all these examples in Chassidus, like we started with these examples, are phrased this way in order to bring this, a truly unconscious experience in a way that's easier to understand, to try and position it in a conscious process. But like I said, now technically, what's truly being said here is that this is the background of all your consciousness. And so we don't really, to explain it, we don't want to choose a radical example of studying until I get Chokhmah. Just explaining the flow of your personality as stemming from this point. Like I said, at the bottom line of Chokhmah is called a stem. This is what everything stems from. Giza, it's called. Shorsha v'giza. The shorish is the root, the spike, the kotzo shel yud, where Chokhmah is flashing from, and the stem is what everything else grows from, the rest of your consciousness.
Gezha, like the word gezha?
Yeah, geza. What geza means is a stem or a trunk, the trunk of the tree. That's a geza. Usually the word geza in Hebrew, you refer to a trunk, a stem, like a flimsy stem wouldn't be called a geza. But that's what the word is. It's a stem, it's just a big stem. Usually in Hebrew. How do you say stem in Hebrew? Givol. Givol is like a flower's trunk, and geza is like a tree trunk. It's the same, but it's the same thing. So what does he say here? let's explain it first, then we'll read it inside because the words aren't, once we understand it, the words are easy. It's not so complicated. He says that what chokhmah is bekoach, as opposed to bina being before. Very, very important phrase here. And this is a diuk, like a precision that I studied once in depth. I heard in a class from Rabbi Shapiro. Very, very important insight. Now, if you're a little bit familiar in Chassidus, so when you study this chapter, and also in the Mefarshim of Tanya, as I recall, so this is like a portion that people kind of, it's also very like seemingly cumbersome sentences. The wording is because it's not clear what's being said, and because the explanation for chokhmah is in many places in Chassidus is like we explained it now, so it's not noticed the precision of what he says here. But what he says is that this mind, this seminal initial chokhmah is nikra b'shem chokhmah, koachma. So what is koachma? He says chokhmah, the word chokhmah is conjured of the two words koach, ma. So we've mentioned before that Bichal in our sages, usually you break down roots to two-letter roots. It's called gates, she'arim. Today in modern Hebrew, so everything is shorashim. We don't really deal with she'arim. We only deal with three-letter roots if you study the Hebrew. But in more ancient Hebrew, so like in Chazal, the root of the root is more important. So he breaks chokhmah into two words, koach ma, like the power or the strength of ma. Now ma, we know everywhere in Kabbalah is bitul. And so here, how could I say, what's the bitul in chokhmah? So I could say, like we said before, that when an idea comes to me, right, it's coming to me, then I need, if you ask me, what are you understanding? So that bothers, I need to be ayin, I need to be receptive, I need to be like an empty vessel. But here he says it more precisely. Really what chokhmah is, I mean, the phrase bekoach and before, those are the phrases he uses here. That chokhmah is, koach means potential. It's not actual. It's only bekoach. And I don't know if is there like a classic way to translate bekoach? It's a classic phrase in Chassidus. I don't know if there's like a term.
In potential. It's usually just translated as in potential.
But I mean, it very distinctly means something that does not exist at all. It's a non-existent. Again, something that's bekoach means that it hasn't happened yet. And before means that it's actual. So that it's like theoretical and actual. So the phrases he uses here isn't that chokhmah is a seed. It's like very small. And like the example we used before presents chokhmah as being a seminal something. But the phrase he uses here is that chokhmah isn't something at all. That goes back to the first allegory I said. That when you open up, like that the example I said, like of a cup at the bottom of the ocean. When the finite vessel opens up, it becomes included in its source. That's what bekoach means. Bekoach means the way something doesn't exist or does exist, you could say the same thing means the same thing, within its root. That's called bekoach. For instance, if I have movement in my hand, so it doesn't exist. It exists in a non-existent way, like we're studying now in Sharachud Emunah, the light within the sun. So bekoach, now this is true bitul. When we say this, now we can understand that when you say bitul is like conceiving yourself as part of your root. If you recall, this is going a few years back at Chavi's house. When we studied Perek Hashem, we studied at length once for a couple of years. and there was one of the ha'arot there about bitul. Right? The beginning of Paragraph Hashem discusses shifus and bitul, if you recall. So the Rav brings there from Rabbi Isaac of Homel, if you remember this. We studied at length a short mimer, a portion, an allegory actually, from Rabbi Isaac, that he says 4 levels of bitul, of the slave, the servant when he's distant from the king, the servant when he's in the presence of the king, how the king views the servant in his eyes, and how the servant views himself the same way the king sees himself, his servant as part of himself. Those are the 4 levels, if you remember this study. So that, again, that took a long, I remember that we devoted the time to that, because it's very, like Rabbi Isaac is usually very, very thin concepts in Rabbi Isaac's Torah. And his mashalim, his allegories are very, very deep and profound, very precise and deep. But that point is very similar, probably identical from as he received all his Torah from the Alter Rebbe. It's very, very identical to what's written here. If you want to explain simply, what is the Alter Rebbe saying here? That Chochmah is bekoach. It's saying that Chochmah is existing as part of your source. So it's conceiving within your source. If you conceive within your source, then you conceive of yourself as not existing. That's called bittul. It's all potential. It's bekoach. So
and your source is Hashem. It's like it exists as you exist in Hashem.
Like if I try to think how HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees me, then that, if I could experience his awareness of myself, that would be Chochmah. And so if I contemplate on my root, on my source, it's called bekoach, that I only exist there bekoach. And this is, again, this concept touches onto very many philosophical fundamental points in Chassidus. That within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, koach, potential, doesn't lack actualization. When I say, my potential lacks actualization, if there's something that I can potentially do, but I haven't done it, so it doesn't exist. But if HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when I say that I exist as part of him, then that means I exist in potential, but that's not a potential that doesn't exist. I actually exist in potential. His potential, his koach, lo chaser po'al. This is a very, very deep philosophical.
Wait, just one more time. But by Hashem, my existence in potential is also actual.
When you say HaKadosh Baruch Hu has something bekoach, it means that it exists. Let's take our very, very technical example. When the cup, if you take a cup and open it at the bottom of the ocean, so it just merges into the borderline of the ocean. There's no cup, doesn't exist. But it doesn't not exist as a lacking. Everything's there. All of the volume and space and borderlines of the cup, it's all there. It's just, it doesn't have any self other, it's included in its root. That's a very technical example, a very good example to explain that. That's called koach lo chaser po'al, a potential that's not less than the actualization. Like the actualized cup is no more than it was. It's the same cup. It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. When it's open, like when it's included in its roots, then it only exists as part of its root. And when it's not included in its root, then it experiences itself as something else. But to the root, it's always part of the root. Right? Take the technical.
Is this a paradox?
It's a paradox. It's definitely a paradox. But again, it's a conceivable paradox. You can understand each side of the paradox. If you try to catch it on both ends, you'll mess your mind up. But you can understand how both angles exist. Again, you have a sea. The bottom of the sea you can picture as a cup, but it's only part of the sea. If you put a cup at the bottom of the sea, so it emerges into the outlines of the sea. Not again, don't forget the plastic cup, just like the hypothetical concept. Where you say, I could say the bottom of the sea is a vessel. I could say it's just part of the sea. That's what chokhmah is. Chokhmah is where you're open to your unconscious. So literally what that means is that you're included in your unconscious. That all of your consciousness exists. Again, it's an existing potential. It's not a non-existing potential. But it only exists as part of the source. You know, like the Alter Rebbe says about the sunlight within the sun. He doesn't say it doesn't exist. He says it does exist there. It exists as part of the sun. That's not called non-existent. Like I can potentially move my hand, but I haven't moved my hand. So there's no movement there. And my potential lacks actualization. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's potential does not lack actualization. Adrabah, actualization lacks HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not HaKadosh Baruch Hu lacks actualization. These are simple concepts. Just they need some you need to be acquainted with the train of thought. So when he says chokhmah, the phrase he uses for chokhmah is bikoach. Bina is before. It's a much more profound ratio of understanding the difference between chokhmah and bina. Chokhmah is an inter-included existence. And bina is an actualized existence. Chokhmah is not an actualized thing. But we said that everything, the entire rest of your personality is all an evolution of Chokhmah. So that's exactly what he wants to say, that all your godly soul is an evolution of being part of Hashem. It's an evolution of a non-actualized thing. It's an actualized evolution, but it's an actualized evolution of really, seminally, of just being part of your source. Yeah.
So now I realize I'm not sure exactly what we mean when we say unconscious.
Unconscious is, I mean, I'm sure we've studied this before, I'm sure. Because, again, today the phrase is used in varying manners. Usually, we would tend to say two general aspects that are referred to as unconscious, and we simply tend to separate between them, even though that's not completely clean cut, which is a subconscious and a superconscious, like under your consciousness and over your consciousness. So let's take the phrase subconscious and put it aside. Subconscious means that it's not really unconscious. It's under your consciousness. For instance, when you walk, you make a lot of unconscious movements with your muscles. You don't think about it. You don't need to move every single muscle in your foot. Unconsciously, it happens. Now, what does it mean that it's unconscious? If you wanted to fret over it, you could sit and think of every muscle in your foot until you cripple yourself. You could do that. You probably wouldn't be able to walk very well. But it's not that it's inherently unconscious. You're capable of being conscious of your foot. It's just like repressed under your consciousness. Okay, so your subconscious is a repressed layer. Could be a very good thing. It's repressed. Like here, if you surface all of your foot, then you're going to have foot aches. You don't want to do that. That your foot works without you needing to move hundreds of muscles is a healthy thing. But still, it's not essentially unconscious. In Chassidus, usually when you say unconscious, what you're referring to is a superconscious. What do you mean a superconscious? A layer of your soul that's it's so large, it's not graspable. It's not that you're not grasping it now. It's not graspable. It's not something that you can contain. It's larger than your vessels, than your internal self. All of your experiential self is like the part of yourself that you can digest, that you can process. but there's infinite more self that's not processable. And
So
that's
this
what
is Ratzon and Tainug and Emuna.
so that's why I said in Chassidus, usually when we talk about unconscious, you're talking about Ratzon, Ta'anug, Emunah, Keter. So that's all superconscious. You could discuss a subconscious and technically separate the two. That's also, again, that separation makes very good sense, and it's a correct way of viewing things, but it's not completely clean cut because there's a very strong connection between, it's called igulim. In Kabbalah, unconscious as opposed to consciousness is the difference between akif and pnimi, circles and lines. So again, a circle circles the line on the top and on the bottom. That's exactly what a circle does. So there's a very strong connection between your subconscious and your superconscious. It's one unconscious, but it appears under your consciousness and over your consciousness. So if I try to explain it experientially, it's very easy for a person to understand that there are things under his consciousness, which mean that he can be conscious of them, but he's not. They're suppressed. And there are things that are over his consciousness that he's not capable of digesting. Really, it's one circle. I mean, we're not going to get into this now, but in that definition, so in Chassidus, when you talk about unconscious, you're simply referring to superconscious. The phrase keter, even though again, also keter means surrounding. So if it's surrounding, it's also surrounding you from the bottom. It's surrounding your entire self. But still, simply when you say keter, then you're referring to your superconscious, which is like you mentioned, emunata nubratzon. So when we say chokhmah, which like we said in Tanya, there is no keter. And all these superconscious faculties are referred to chokhmah. So it's also understand why the Alter Rebbe insists on phrasing chokhmah correctly, even though in I think every other place in Chassidus that I know of, like this phrase, chokhmah is bekoach and bina is befoal. I don't think I've ever seen that in Chassidus. I mean, it's in Tanya. You don't need more than Tanya for anything. But it's not, like, again, even when we try to explain it, so first we explained how it's usually explained just to get the idea in your head. It's hard to conceive what does that mean to exist in potential. It's much easier to explain the experience of Chokhmah on the background of Bina. That something flashes into a consciousness. But really what the Alter Rebbe wants to say is that this is what's flashing your consciousness. So it's like it's where you already exist in your root. And that is the seminal seed of your actualized existence. So my actualized awareness is an evolution of my seminal existence as part of Hashem, as part of the root. And Chokhmah is the experience of that intermediate point. That's the beginning of myself. Reshit Chokhmah. The beginning of Pnimius is like the paradoxal point where the cup is also intercluded in the sea, and it's also a cup. So I could say, when I open up my cup at the bottom of the sea, so I've also intercluded in the sea, and I've also filled my cup. I could say my cup has been filled. Like I received something into my cup. But again, it's funny to say that way because there's no cup. So usually in Chassidus, that's the point stressed. The Chokhmah is receiving the seminal flash, like filling the cup. But if you understand correctly what Chassidus is explaining, when that happens, the cup is part of the sea. There's no cup. That's why it's bittul.
Mm-hmm.
So
no, there was a song of Searchers I remember from over 47 years ago before I was from. I am a bubble, make me the sea.
That's yeah. Okay. So we are cups, and we want Hashem to make us.
Is a bubble a better example than a cup?
What's the? I'll tell you why I like the idiom of the cup, even though again it's very technical. It depicts well that the sea is on top, right? It's like it's the beginning, and the cup is on the bottom of the sea, right? Because that's how we want to, like, if you picture the soul, like today there's the Etz Chaim, right? The 10 Sfirot, Chochmah Bina Dat. If you look in the sources of that diagram, so how is it diagrammed? That it's diagrammed as an upside down tree. Right? As a tree growing downwards. Where
Interesting.
the roots of the tree, usually like you depict two trees like this, and the roots of the tree, which are underground, are infinitely deeper than the stemming upside down tree. That's the original diagram. So the cup in the bottom of the sea, just it works better with gravity than the upside down tree on the world. So to depict the inter-inclusiveness, we could use any phrase. But I like that image because it depicts like correctly what's happening here. That your consciousness is like it's on the bottom. What do I mean it's on the bottom? It's a result. It's not a cause. Right? And the sea here, the unconscious, is the cause. Is causing your consciousness. I want to put the cause on top, like a chain reaction. So that's why I like that image of the sea and the cup.
Okay.
Whatever, you could use any sea. I got no idea. There's no sea and there's no cup. You can do bubbles.
Okay.
So that's the first point here. Chokhmah is koachma. So it's the power of not being, which means being inter-included in your source. Liyot bekoach. That's the phrase in Chassidus. You exist in potential. So when you actualize that potential, שמתבונן בשכלו להבין דבר לאשורו ולעומקו מתוך איזה דבר חוכמה מושכל בשכלו, נקרא בינה. So when you take that now you take that cup and you develop the finitized, like we said before, the chokhmah, it's also part of the sea, but it's also a full cup. Now, if you take that piece of the sea, it's filling the cup, and you elaborate it and expand it in the womb. That's why Bina is Ima, because it takes the seminal, where everything exists, like infinite version, but seminal infinite version, and develops it. But again, now the womb is already developing a finitized infinity. Again, so it's one child. It's one idea. It's even though there's infinite depth and infinite richness in that seminal infinity, but it's still specific. It's a specified infinity. And now you take it and you develop, you expand it. So again, there's like two opposite processes. You're like that diagram of two opposite trees. There's like on the one hand, you could say that Chokhmah is an immense contraction, right? Everything beyond Chokhmah is immense. Keter is immense. And Chokhmah is still part of that immensity of your unconscious. Or you could say the opposite. That Chokhmah is a tiny, tiny seminal seed. And Bina expands it, like in proportions of yourself. You could view your unconscious as being very small or very large. Both are true. Like in a Kabbalistic point of view, it's truer, like from Hashem's point of view, it's truer to say that myself is very small. It's an elaboration of a specified infinity. But in my experience, it's the opposite. Chokhmah is like a point. Everything exists there very small. Only in Bina does it start forming into something, turning into something. That's called minakoach el hapa'al, that you're taking something that existed inter-included and you're actualizing it. So the power to actualize like evolved, is bina. That's what he says. Vehen hem av va'em. So this is Abba ve'ima, like in Kabbalah. Chokhmah and Bina are Abba ve'ima. Hamalidot ahavat Hashem v'yirato u'pchado. So this will, the next stage of evolution is where this inseminated infinity is expanded, so it already births an existence. What's an existence? An existence is an experiential self. That's what an amidah is. Amidah, like love or fear, is already an experiential self. You've taken a piece of infinity, you've actualized it, and you develop it into an experiential thing. So that's what the mind births a heart. A heart is like taking a concept, and experiencing it as something that exists. Like if I understand that something's very, very dangerous, the understanding is me sinking in the concept. But if that makes me, I say that now I can say, after I've understood it, I can say that this concept feels nice. It becomes a thing suddenly. Right? The concept, which was just me being inside the idea, now becomes an idea inside me, and I can feel it. It becomes an it. That's called a midah.
So just to put it together, what you said last week about Avas Hashem of the divine soul is experiencing Hashem's Ahava, not like the love of the animal soul where it's my experience. So is this Avas Hashem a personal experience?
Yeah, it's like turning Hashem into something tangible. I love Hashem, right? What do I mean when I say, if I understand the Kadosh Baruch Hu, or I have dveikus, I cling to Hashem. So really, that's all. I don't exist. Only Hashem exists. But if I catch that and I elaborate it so much that it births an experience, there's an experience birthed out of that contemplation on Hashem. So now I can say I love Hashem. What does it mean? I love Hashem. It's like Hashem has become a thing. It's like it was given birth, like a child. So my experience, the godly soul's experiential love, is like taking the chokhmah, the inter-inclused existence, and making it something that stands alone. Every midah is like a standalone piece of Hashem. Fear, love. That's why it's called giving birth. So the idiom of the mind is like a father and a mother inseminating each other. And the heart is like a child birthed of them, where the father and the mother that together become something. And that thing, they can pick him up and look at him. Here we are. You can pick up that thing and say it exists. You've actualized what was only in potential. Again, but as I said, when we think of actualizing potential, we think of something that wasn't in existence. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu actualized potential, it's just a question of the same thing you can see actualized or only inter-inclused. But it actually exists in Hashem. It doesn't not actually exist. Before I had a child, I didn't have a child. He didn't exist. And when I say I had potential to birth a child, it means that I could do that, not that it exists somewhere. When you say here, you're saying that Kadosh Baruch Hu, this finitude exists in him, part of him. And birthing it just means that it also exists as a self that can see itself not as part of him. There's nothing else here, nothing new. So this needs maybe a little more elaboration. But just understand the psychological process. That chokhmah is being exposed to my unconscious, so I become part of my higher self, we'll call it. On the one hand, on the other hand, it's like a cup full of myself. I can pick that portion of self and elaborate it, that's bina. And that will birth it to be a thing. And then that finitude becomes a specific thing. That's your heart, your love, your fear. So that's what we've said up until now. And next week we'll do the heart. And then we'll see that he goes back to dot. He skipped dot. So after he explains the heart, at the end of the chapter, he'll go back and say, all this depends on having dot. We'll see that. We'll see that later on. What we said about Hashem.
Great. Shkoya. Thank you.
So,